And I realized that in my life, my church-going life, I had a very strong impulse to flee to Tarshish rather than just to stay and argue with these people I can't stand sometimes and work through it and work through that conflict. I think that's something that I think we need to press into more. Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
Strap in. This is going to be interesting.
Bumpy ride.
Bumpy ride. We're going to talk about something I think that is on the hearts and minds of a lot of people lately, and that is dissatisfaction with one's local congregation. I think this is something
Whatever could you mean, Cameron?
Well, yeah. So you don't go to the perfect church. It's not an ideal church. And I think COVID in some ways probably exacerbated this. I know that we're still working through all of the data and making sense of it, and it takes time to interpret all of that information. But of course, you notice there's a steady decline in church attendance. That's not really that surprising. Again, we've talked a lot about how we're in a cultural moment where there's a higher social cost to being a Christian that's emerging, and then that's some people are just not returning for various reasons. If there's no social advantage to Christianity, why continue going to church? You can just do something else on your Sunday. But that's really not what I'm talking about here, Nathan. I've just noticed, and I'm curious, so I'm going to just relate my own experience here and then see if this strikes a chord with you as well, Nathan. In many conversations I have with friends in town or when I'm on the road, there's a common refrain, and it has to do with complaints about one's own church. And there's a sense in which, it's not either it's not rigorous enough or it's watered down or there's one problem here. And there's just
It's
this
not welcoming,
sense,
or it's too seeker sensitive, or the music is dated, or the pastor doesn't preach in the style that I grew up with. The
on
list
and
goes
on
on
we
and
could
on.
go. Yeah, this happens. And
Children's
this
program
happens.
isn't sufficient.
Yeah. So this happens a lot. I'm curious, is that are you running into that as well,
Yeah.
Nathan?
So, okay, well, let me ask a question here. So, I think you're really onto something with your question. On the other hand, I also wonder, it's sort of like, I don't know, you're looking at something on Amazon that has a bunch of like 2-star reviews. And is the product really bad, or are you more likely to make yourself known if you're complaining than if you have something good to say? So if I show up, small town USA church, and then 3 people afterward want to tell me about how, you know, yeah, dissatisfied, I guess is the word you used, they are. Is that indicative of the entire congregation, or did I find those 3 people, or they found me
Mhm.
to want to tell me about it? So I think there's a little bit of, um, particularly in a time in which it is rather vogue to bash on the church. It has plenty of critics. So I'm just balancing that out in my mind to some sense of saying, okay, it's a fashionable thing to do. However, that is the lived experience of a lot of people, that there's an uneasiness or a yeah, I think, yeah, dissatisfaction probably is the word that you started us off with and is best. So I'm affirming what you're seeing while putting in the caveat that there are complainers are going to complain, but there I think there's a broader thing at play as well.
Yeah, and I'm curious. I mean, one item I think that's worth noting, and this is an obvious one, but let's tick this box, is that we often come to church with a consumer mindset. I mean, that's just true.
Well,
We're
okay,
wired and conditioned like that.
and let's just rewind historically there a little bit, in which church you went to had more to do with geography than, a selection criteria. It was geographically bounded. Which one could you walk to? Which church could you hear the bell from? I mean, a lot of churches still have bells in them. That's a piece of technology from not that long ago, that the church bells would ring and you would know what time it is to start heading in that direction. So, um, yeah, we are in new territory with the ability to have the degree of choice that we currently do. I think, yeah, it does produce a consumer. I would love to know the per like, if anybody let's ask ChatGPT this. I wonder how many people what percentage of Americans who go to church drive past another church on the way to their church? I
I
would say
mean,
it's extremely high.
extremely high. I mean, especially if it depends on your geography, of course, as well. If you're in the southeast, I mean, you'll pass a lot of churches for sure. Yes, I want to actually let's camp out, Nathan, on that point you just made about
Like
geography, to use a well-worn phrase, because I think that is really interesting because it's so foreign to what we would to our experience now. So that is true. In the past, you were limited by your geography, and so your choice in the matter was also limited. This is the
Mhm.
church you have because this is where you live, and these are your people, for better or for worse.
Yeah.
There's
And you're
something
doing
actually
business
quite
with them, you're
healthy.
playing sports with them, you're babysitting their kids, you're probably
Yes,
related to some of them. It's all one big ball of wax.
right. And so this is a very vibrant community. In the sense that you're sharing life together. You have your shared experience, and at this point, your pastor is also somebody who knows a lot about you and
And is a
what you
member of the
do, your way of
community,
life.
not just the leader of the church.
Correct. And so sermons are going to look a lot more personal. And I think by our standards, we would say maybe somewhat invasive
Mhm.
because now, I mean, you're in each other's faces, you're in each other's lives. You can mess with one another. And I think one of the features of our more global cosmopolitan era is that you get very generic sermons. Generic, not in the sense that this is not I'm not using this as a pejorative word and slamming these sermons. I'm saying generic in the sense that people are keenly aware this is going to be recorded, this is going to be streamed. Many other people are going to hear this. So speak to the people in the room, but also speak to everyone.
Mhm.
Nathan, I remember you and I got that we got that admonition actually at a former occupation of ours when we were at a big
Yeah.
ministry. We were always told it's you and I in particular were singled out because we would tailor our remarks to people in the room and get real
I would use
personal.
people's
And it's
names in the congregation as examples and call them people, which really limited the ability to copy and paste that globally.
precisely, so you're not supposed to do that because we want to stream this and we want to package this and take this on the road and just disseminate it widely. But again, you have a much more shrunken down vision when you have that, but also a much more, I mean, intimate, personal. There's a lot more accountability baked into this model, but also think about the way choice is limited. Now, in theory, you probably could make a pilgrimage to a church that's further, down the road, so to speak, but it's going to come at great cost and it's going to come with considerable effort and considerable time, and also risks potential estrangement from your actual community. Hey, why is Simon, I don't know why it's Simon. Why is Simon heading all the way down the road there? But we don't think about that as much now. I mean, sure, we parse commutes and all of that, but I know many people, I'm sure you do, Nathan, as well, who commute upward 40 to over an hour to their
Mhm.
church because, quote, but it's worth it for this church. I've heard this many times. And again, this isn't necessary. I'm just being descriptive here. This is not necessarily a criticism, but the church. But usually, what it means, what it's worth it for this church means that there's fantastic preaching, excellent worship, and some deep friendships have been forged. No, no, those are not items you want to downplay. But I mean, one of the assumptions used to be you want to be pouring into where you are in your own. I mean, your own town, your own neighborhood, so to speak. And if you're, yeah, so Nathan has
Well,
something to
I
say.
mean, so tell me this though. This is so ingrained into the American religious. Like, there's a really old. You remember? It's a really old joke about the guy who's marooned on an island by himself for years and years and years, and finally, a ship comes by and they rescue him. And as they're pulling away, the sailors look and see three buildings on the island that the man had built, and they said, what are the buildings?" And then he said, "Well, the one building is my house. One building is my church." And they said, "Well, what about the other one?" And he said, "Oh, that's the church I used to go to."
Yeah,
And so we
yeah.
use that as a joke of like even a person on an island by themselves changed churches once. You know, so I guess we shouldn't laugh at that. That's kind of sad. But the fact that a joke like that exists highlights the depth of the question that you're asking us to deal with here.
When somebody says to you, Nathan, "This church, there's nothing wrong with it whatsoever. It just wasn't a fit for me." What goes through your mind when you hear something like that? Because that's a really interesting phrase, and I hear that kind of statement
Hmm.
quite a lot, actually,
Okay, I
in
hear the
various
not
ways.
feeding me phrase more than the fit phrase, but I think by and large, fit has more, yeah, to do with are the other people there like me, and are things done in the style that make me comfortable?
Yeah, and is this a match for my personality? What why I find that striking is, and again, at the risk of making a potentially offensive or strong statement,
Well, you go to an
that's
INTJ
language.
church.
Well,
Nah.
yeah, that's yeah, there you go. Well, that's so customized, that's personalized language. That sounds almost like a dating app to me. And it's once again, fit implies a lot about, I mean, to my mind, we're getting into the territory of a lot of personal taste as well. Now, the not feeding me thing, I've heard that too. But it's also that's a phrase about which I'm quite circumspect
Mhm.
because that could mean, so usually I think usually what that means is the preaching isn't rich enough,
Yeah.
or it isn't compelling, or it isn't holding my attention. And by the way, I think those are legitimate. They can be
Mhm.
legitimate complaints, but I'm also keenly aware of the fact that we have a deep and serious aversion to repetition and to routine, and that we crave, I'm speaking from personal experience, and that I should say, crave novelty and something
Hmm.
interesting all the time. And the truth is, some many sermons are going to be boring. You walk into a church on a Sunday morning with all sorts of junk in your head. Now, if you're if you're playing your cards right, so to speak, what you want to do is try to go in there and clear your mind as much as you can and focus and listen and be attentive, and to use Christian language here, prepare your heart for worship, right? But we have cares and concerns and unanswered emails that are lingering in our minds, and so sometimes we often sleepwalk our way through worship services. That's just the truth. But that doesn't mean we're not getting something very important out of it. Just because it hasn't been a thrilling, compelling, emotionally intense experience doesn't mean it's not beneficial to you.
Mhm.
I'm gonna pause
Yeah.
there for a second.
Yeah, so I until recently in life, I would say that I've never heard a sermon that I didn't learn something from. Now, some of those things that I learned are like, I will never say that in public, or yeah, that's a terrible way to do that. So I was learning something, but
Note
it
to
was
self, not to do.
yeah, note to self. I, I'm starting to think there might be a sermon or two that I was like, no, I got nothing here. But um, in my travels, but the yeah, so by and large, we want measurable results. That's one part of the consumer, the backside of the consumer mindset is that when I invest something, I have something in my hand to hold on the other side of it. I pay this money, I get this thing. I go do this, I spend time doing this, I have this skill or ability. So the the question is, what is the proper measure? Okay, so what then is a good church service? How do I know I'm successful? What does it mean? Like the words sound weird coming out of my mouth because those
Mhm.
aren't the metrics by which we measure worship. So
Right.
I think that has maybe as much to do with it as we don't have a good vocabulary, or at least not a vocabulary that we use the rest of the week.
Mhm.
Um, so if somebody says to you, "How was church on Sunday?" 100% of people are going to say it was good. Now, we say that about you. So we're kind of give me some words. Like, what are some of the like? If I was going to evaluate,
Yep.
help me out.
Yeah, so what is a quote, good church service? It does sound odd when you put it into terms like that. It would sound even stranger if you said, "Let me review." What if you had somebody, I'm sure somebody does this. What if you had somebody who reviewed church services, so to speak? There's
Michelin
something that
stars.
yeah, there's something that just seems really odd about that. Well, that was a 3-star sermon, and there was a 3 star, the worship wasn't that great that time. So, I think the best way I could put it right here on the spot would be that a quote, good worship service would be one that is geared to glorify God in all of its aspects. Now, that doesn't necessarily translate into excellence in the execution of every element, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
that means that the people involved are doing their utmost, using their whole personalities and their gifts and their talents to worship
And bodies.
God and to glorify his name together. And so, plenty of days, I mean, that might you may have a that might result in a stellar sermon and a wonderful, leading of worship. I don't hesitate to call it a worship performance because it's not really
Mhm.
supposed to be a performance. But it may be that may be a day where see, this is why the spiritual and we're gonna get to something this okay, this brings in something really interesting, Nathan. The spiritual and this is a point that our friend Ken Boa makes a lot. The spiritual can't be measured in the kind of qualitative ways that we really value as modern people. Now, so that means that the pastor may show up and to the best of his abilities give the most god honoring and surrendered message that is in terms of just its execution and communication quite mediocre,
Mhm.
and this will have been but again in spiritual terms it is not mediocre. This is an act of worship, and for those with ears to hear and eyes to see there is real nourishment there. So I'll pause on that. That's one aspect I would say. So, a great worship service does not necessarily mean excellent execution.
Yeah, it also doesn't mean it makes me feel good because conviction
Absolutely
rarely
not. Yeah.
does. Um, so recognition of the holiness of God, confession, you know, those are not like, "Oh boy, I really got out of bed for this morning," because, I thought it'd make me feel great. So there's definitely that part to it. I think also I was thinking in terms of yeah, there are churches that I've gone to on vacation, stopping or something where I'm like, no, I would not go to this church if I lived here,
Mhm.
because it felt performative and plastic, and everything was cultivated and manipulated into a synthetic expression of spirituality that just it's like fake fruit as a table decoration. So
Hmm.
love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, So the fruit of the spirit, is that made manifest in the people who are gathered there to worship? And is it something also like when we think about worship, it not only is an expression of God receiving praise and glory, but it also then has a missional element on it on the flip side. So, is my church equipping the saints for ministry? Do I leave church thinking, and this is then what I'm being shaped and formed into to be part of the work of the church
Mhm.
for the next 6 days? Or, oh, got that over with. We'll go have lunch, catch a football game, and life goes on. And so I think those are um, the fruit aspect and element of it would be one of the things that I would add in addition to what you were saying.
Yeah, and then there's that repetition piece, which I've been thinking about that more and more, and this is because James K. A. Smith brings this up really helpfully. I believe it's in Imagining the Kingdom. But just that we have this deeply ingrained aversion to repetition. And so what does that mean? On a Sunday, oh, I'm so tired of the pastor always he makes the same point. It's always going to go to the same place. It's always going to be I just feel that this is the very height of tedium. But part of what forms us for better or for worse is repetition. And this is true in so many practical ways. I always love to use the phrase wax on wax off from Karate Kid
Mm,
because so often the mundane phrases that we think are bored, tired, shop worn, that they're not very yeah, they're just not as exciting can actually make a huge difference because worship is all about forming you. And we human beings are uniquely formable. And it's amazing how much, what's not amazing, it's amazing how amazed we are as Christians that modern, for instance, neurological research is confirming that, shocker, you can change your neural pathways. You are
mhm.
literally physically also a transformable creature.
Yeah.
And that's true, and a huge part of that, though, is repetition. Whether we're talking about exercise, whether we're talking about practice with a certain habit, whether you wanna learn calligraphy or learn how to play basketball, it involves repetition. And a good part of church is going to be repetition, repetition of essential truths of the gospel that we have to hear, repetition of the fact that God is God and we are not, and we are creatures, repetition of the fact that we're made in his image, that we are made to be transformed and filled with the Holy Spirit. So I think that's another aspect. So to the boring sermons, to those, it's funny because at my church, that's a great way to begin. To the boring sermons. Speaking of that, of my church, I'm not saying my pastor gives boring sermons, but I'm saying one feature of our church there. So my son doesn't have there's a youth group, but there isn't a Sunday school class for kids his age. So and this is by design. And theologically and philosophically, I can be on board with this, but still it's annoying sometimes when I have to sit in the sermon because I'm keenly aware of how long the whole thing is with Dylan sitting right next to me the whole time. And, he does okay, but sometimes I have to, there are so many kids in there who we're all basically trying to fight this quiet battle to keep them, from doing too
S-
much, being too distracting during communion or whatever. But part of it is also it's good because I'm seeing this whole pattern and I'm hoping that he's noticing it. He's noticing some of the weird elements. He's asking more and more questions about what we're doing with communion. And yeah, and by and large, he's sitting there just kicking his legs and trying to color some picture and just get through it. But it's good that he's in there, and it makes me aware once again of how time can crawl in that room, but how that's also good for me.
Mhm. Yeah, my
And yeah,
grandpa talks about as a kid, long sermons were where he learned to catch flies, wiggle his ears, a whole list of
that's right. Yeah,
things that you can only learn by sitting silently for an extended amount of time.
count the
But
rafters. Yeah.
so I want to loop back though because I think there's a yeah but or a yes and to what you were saying about the fact that we are so formative, like we can be shaped and formed by repetition, which means that a church can also seriously mess you up. And
Yeah,
so
that's the other
the
side, isn't it? Yeah.
so that's the other side of it is that don't hear us saying like, "Ah, just walk to your local church and stick it out regardless." Yeah, there's some thoughtfulness that needs to go into that because um there are other powers at play at why churches form in a consumeristic culture. Or I've been to churches, I'm like, that had nothing to do with worshiping the Lord. That was just a spiritualized pep rally for some other ideology or agenda that we slapped some Bible verses onto and called it good, but everybody felt great about
Mm,
it. And out we go. I've been to churches that by and large, people stood up, said the liturgy, somebody preached a sermon based off of a William Blake poem. Everybody was happy and went home. And you're like, what in the world just happened? And it's like
yeah.
this the fact that there wasn't an uprising or rebellion in the middle of it um, was shocking to see the degree to which the congregation was just I can't say that. You know, anesthetized,
Anesthetized.
anesthetized, um, to like. So I think it is incumbent upon us to be using our critical engagement and evaluating. But I guess what we're trying to bore down into are like, what are the categories that actually matter? Because like, oh, there are too many screaming babies in the sanctuary is not a reason to feel
Mm,
dissatisfied with your church. To say, oh, sometimes there's repetition in the messaging is not a reason to be dissatisfied with your church. So I guess I'm not sure if we're actually answering the question we're asking, other than to point out that it's worth radically thinking through. Um, or how about this as a question? What type of person will I be if I do this for the next 10 years?
yeah. And may I bring in one last I think the real heart of this though, Nathan, is not sermons, it's not worship styles, it's really people. People are always the problem.
Probably.
Just yeah, people can be the worst, right? So not Dallas Willard. Nope, not Dallas Willard. Stanley Hauerwas this time. Sorry. It's so ingrained in me.
Faked you out, everybody.
Yes. So Stanley Hauerwas has a great quote. He has a lot of them. This is another one where he says, "When basically the witness of the church should be something along the lines of, wow, these people hate each other, but they stay together. So let me preface this by saying, are there reasons to leave a church when there is abuse going on? Of course. When people are absolutely abusing their power or mishandling things or being, there are reasons to leave, of course. This is a fallen sinful world. But conflict, arguing, being annoyed, really being aggravated with people is absolutely inevitable. If you're going to sink into if you're going to enter deeply into any community, think about your family, and that's the closest analogy you really should have with your church. It's not a social gathering in that sense. This is more like family. People are going to drive you crazy, and that's okay. In fact, that's where you we have to learn how to phrase I've been using is we have to learn how to fight well for our churches, and we have to learn how to the same as within a marriage, right? You have to learn how to argue well. This is an essential skill. And I think that is where we just as a culture are so poorly trained when it comes to handling conflict. In fact, most I would say the cultural response is largely just various strategies of avoiding conflict or just terminating the relationship entirely and just leaving and
Mhm.
walking away. There's all sorts of language that you can call to mind here. Well, this is just a toxic person, so I'm just gonna get them out of my life. Again, just to say there are people who can make your life very difficult and relationships that are unhealthy and where there are times where there of course there needs to be separation, but as a as a Christian, though, I would caution anybody. I know what's meant by toxic person, somebody who sows seeds of conflict wherever they go and is filled with deception. But I mean, I want to point out all people are made in the image of God. So I'm be very hesitant to call
Mm.
anybody a toxic person. But that's another issue. But that aside, I think learning to work through conflict, and that means you have to stay. That doesn't preclude having to, eventually saying, "Okay, we've gotta go," because there are things here that won't ever change. But let me just say one thing and then kick it over to you, Nathan. For I think, in the college years, especially if you grew up in the church and you went to a Bible college, as say I did, usually, there'll be an intense pull to some there can be a time of if you're studying theology, an intense pull to some sort of exotic expression of the faith or something that's it's a little bit more distant. I'm gonna speak in vague terms here. I'm not gonna get too specific. Maybe a magisterial tradition not knocking magisterial traditions, but something draws you. This was certainly the case with me. And but part of what emerged for me was I had it was just the classic, I had an ideal church in my head, and I found Eugene Peterson's Under the Unpredictable Plant kinda helpful in this aspect. So, he takes a bit of a some creative license as he talks about the book of Jonah. Usually Jonah is, we see Jonah's fleeing attempted flight to Tarshish as him, trying to escape the will of God. He's been called to Nineveh. He hates those people, just want to go to Nineveh. And Eugene Peterson accepts that, but he also puts a different spin on there, which I think it was helpful to me. So if this is helpful to you. Tarshish is also a place where the grass is greener. It's different. It's distant. It's exotic. It's free of all those problems and all those people that I don't want to deal with anymore. And I realized that in my life, my church going life, I had a very strong impulse to flee to Tarshish rather than just to stay and argue with these people I can't stand sometimes and work through it and, work through that conflict. I think that's something that I think we need to press into more.
Yeah, that's a good word. I think, is it Oz Guinness who said everybody loves the idea of community until they find out there are other people in it?
That's
Um,
perfect. There you go.
yeah, so there's a bit of that. I think, um, there's one other, not to stretch this out too much longer, but there's one other type of dissatisfaction that actually, as you're saying all these things, pops into my mind. And that's the person who is pretty sure that they have a vision for where the church should go and how the church should be, and nobody else can
Mhm.
get on board with
Yep.
their plan. And so it's often the dissatisfied person is the one who actually wants to be the worship leader to do it the way that they want it to be done. And I'm pretty sure the church would flourish if they did that. Or the person who has the idea, if only we did this curriculum for the Sunday school program, then the kids would be better at this. And only if we did, and so there's this like pent up, I have the energy, I have the vision, and nobody else will go along with me. That's a level of dissatisfaction and frustration. And I think it's one we have to be extremely cautious about. Um, how much meism gets embedded into that. So I think there's a time in which having people who have energy and insight and understanding is a real value, but you have to recognize that a church to change the direction of a church is like turning the Titanic around in a creek. You have to pump a lot of water under it before change can actually be made. And
Mhm.
so when you're up against historical ways of doing it and different understandings, um, I can't tell you how many times in our church I've come up with what I thought was a great idea, and it was like, "Nah," like, "Okay, well, the body decided on that." And then like a year and a half later, somebody will be like, "Oh, I had this idea. I think we should." And it's my exact same idea. And everybody's like, "Yeah, that sounds great." And I just sit back and like, "Mm-hmm." So sometimes I think one thing that if you're a person who has a vision for how things could be crafted and changed, from my experience, I would say people respond better to having a seed planted than to having a full blown mature tree delivered. So
There you go.
sometimes I
Yep.
think if you have a vision like this would be great to have an apple tree. Boom, here's the whole apple tree. People are like, whoa, too much change too fast. And if you think about what if we had an orchard here in 15 years, that's a better way to ease in on that. So I think that would be I love my home church, and they're so good for me and the way that I'm wired and keeping me organized and lined up. And I think I contribute to some of who they are as well. So there's a give and take there, but recognizing that sometimes the pushback and the balancing isn't because the idea or the vision that you have is bad. It's just that the timing isn't right, or
Mhm.
the conviction or vision isn't there to compel other people to make those changes as well. So
Mm.
I think I want to throw that timing piece in there as another one
Mhm.
of because I don't know a single person who is in congregational leadership who is satisfied with where their church is. Even people who love, even leaders who love their church. I
Yeah.
mean, it's kind of like that is the job of the pastor to say, here's where we are and here's where we're going. And how do we make the changes at an acceptable rate of change that we don't kill everybody in the process? And we're growing. And so the church is fundamentally a wax on, wax off for a purpose type institution where there's always will be a vision of we are not yet what we ought to be. We are not yet
Mhm.
uh, not yet sanctified into the fullness of what Christ has for us. We do not yet know and have not yet experienced. We have tasted and seen, but that has not been brought to fulfillment. Like that is what the church is. And so to have
Mhm.
a holy unrest or dissatisfaction is not necessarily um, a sense of like, well, this is a failing church. Nope, that could be just a
Mhm.
big part of what it means to actually be part of a church. So I would just throw that out there for your consideration as you think through your uneasiness of could this uneasiness be good? Is this part of life together?
Mm.
Is this part of community? Um, what am I learning and what is being shaped and formed in me while I'm processing the thing that makes me uncomfortable or I dislike? Those are really great places of growth. When you're thrown in on the
Mm.
pew with the chaos of everybody else's lives, and your life is inconvenienced, and you're grown in good ways because you aren't the master of your own destiny or your own worship experience or your own spiritual growth and formation in every single category of life. And so, putting ourselves in places where we see legitimate fruit being expressed in individual lives and collectively, and where the Lord is worshiped and the neighbor is served, and we experience the joy of faithful obedience. That's a good place to be, a good place to grow, but it doesn't mean that the experience and the feeling is always going to be good in it.
Nathan was preaching. It's always good
Nah,
to end
sorry.
like that. Well, mull this over. Think it through. These are thoughts submitted for your consideration. Thank you for thinking along with us on a complex and messy topic, one to which we will probably return at some point. And just in case you missed it, you are listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events in your church and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.